on this F30 328i xDrive behind us. This is going to be the same for any F30 xDrive car, or really any F22 or F23 2 Series xDrive car, or even any F32, F33, F36 4 Series xDrive car. So it's a very relatively straightforward process. You are going to need certain tools, and there's a couple things you need to be aware of while doing this repair. But with that said, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need to do this job first, and then we'll go from there. So some of the tools you're going to need in order to do control arms on the front of an F30 xDrive car, definitely some electric tools or pneumatic impact tools if you have them, going to use those. So we have this Milwaukee M12 stubby, this is Milwaukee electric ratchet. You need a T40 socket, a 17mm hex, 21mm impact socket, 17mm socket for moving your lug bolts, 8mm socket for removing some of the splash shield screws, an 18mm socket for some of the control arm bolts, and another 21mm socket for the ball joint, for both the front arm and the rearward arm, a 3-inch extension. Along with those sockets, you're going to need a 21mm wrench, a variety of ratchets. So I primarily am only going to be using 3/8 ratchets, with the exception of this longer 1/2-inch style breaker bar that happens to be ratcheting. And you're going to want torque wrenches that have a torque range of approximately 100 Newton meters upwards of 210 Newton meters. Different control arms require different torque specs. So generally speaking, you want a torque wrench that'll be somewhere in the middle of the range. So in this case, we have two different variations. One's a 3/8 drive and one's a 1/2-inch drive. 1/2-inch drive is obviously going to be for the higher torque range. So now we've talked about some of the tools that you're going to need to do the job. Let's just go ahead and get right into it. First thing we're going to do is remove the wheel, 17mm. So it makes this job different on the xDrive than it would on a normal rear-wheel drive car, is we have to remove the front axle bolt in order to move the axle enough out of the way to get the thrust arm out of the knuckle. So this is a 17mm hex. It has quite a bit of torque load on it, so leverage is going to be your friend. It does take quite a bit to break that free. So a long breaker bar is going to be required for that. Once it's free, you can just run it out. And that's what the axle bolts look like, for those of you who are wondering. There you can see the stub through the hub, but it's a splined interface. You'll see that in a minute. So now that we have the axle bolt out, you can see how much I can move this CV joint around, and that's in order to remove this ball joint from the knuckle here. A lot of corrosion on these threads, so to make removal of these nuts a little bit easier on these studs, I'm just using a little bit of PB Blaster on it. It's not going to help with the breakaway torque, but it'll at least provide some lubrication to the threads when I'm taking the nut off. This is a 21mm nut. Let's see if it'll spin off on its own. The ball joint is now spinning inside of there, which is a little sucky because now I'm gonna have to counter hold here, and that's a 21mm wrench that I have to use. But the positive here is it's loose from the taper, so I'm not gonna have to worry about trying to separate that with a ball joint separator. So using a T40 Torx and a 21mm wrench, key here is we want to get this nut off this ball joint stud, and there's quite a bit of resistance just because of the corrosion here. I'm gonna use a T40 socket instead. See if I can spin the stud, which I can. You wanna be careful with that because you could strip it out. So make sure the bit is all the way in the stud for the counter hold. One crusty, disgusting nut is gone. Next up, we have several 8mm self-tapping screws that hold this fender liner to the bumper cover. Need to remove it in order to remove the bolt that holds the control arm bushing in place. All right, now that those are out of there, we have access to the bolt, which is an 18mm. Breakaway torque on this is actually pretty substantial, but once it does break free, you should be able to move it out by hand. There is no nut to counterhold. The nut is actually on the subframe, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, next up, we're just gonna rotate the wheel hub a little bit so we can get a little bit more wheel room out of our axle. And then we're gonna pull the thrust arm out, pull it down, and there we go. This would be impossible if you didn't undo the axle from the wheel bearing. So next up, we're going to install the new thrust arm first before we remove the wishbone, just so we actually have something to work with here. It's important to use new hardware. On these Lemforder OEM control arms, they are labeled L and R. So right here is our right control arm. That's how we know it's the correct one. Also, if we're using the wrong one, probably wouldn't fit. So first thing we need to do is get the ball joint in the knuckle, and then we can worry about getting it up on the subframe. So, working with the room that we have available, I want to try to get the stud to drop in first. We're going to put the new nut onto the ball joint so it can't go anywhere. And then next, we need to sort of push the control arm up into position. Onto the subframe. And you're gonna have to do some eyeballing here in terms of lining up the hole for the control arm, where the bolt goes, and on the subframe. We're not gonna completely tighten that down. We do need to torque that at ride height, so leave it like that for now. So I got 21 millimeter here, and hopefully this nut will actually tighten up against the knuckle easily. And it's spinning. So we're using the T40 and the 21 mil wrench again to tighten the nut and the ball joint. We'll torque that when we tighten the bolt for the bushing. Next, we're also gonna go ahead and do the wishbone. We're gonna go ahead and remove more of these 8 millimeter fasteners to give us a little bit more space for removing the bolt and the nut that holds the control arm to the subframe. Should be able to get by with just removing these two. This is pretty flexible, so no problem there. I'm gonna try to break this nut free with the 21 to swivel, but it's probably gonna be the same story as the thrust arm ball joint. She ain't having it. Take a 21 millimeter wrench. We're gonna try to break this nut free. It's probably gonna require quite a bit of force. And the ball joint stud is spinning again, which means this is loose in the knuckle, which is a nice and bad problem at the same time, because we don't have the resistance of the ball joint in the knuckle to prevent it from spinning. So we're doing the T40 and 21 mil thing now. Using an 18 millimeter wrench and an 18 millimeter socket to remove this bushing bolt and nut. A lot of corrosion on the thread, so it's probably gonna fight all the way out. So next up, we're gonna go ahead and install our new mounting bolt and nut. Just gonna loosely thread the nut on for now. We'll torque everything once it's at ride height. Push the new ball joint up into the knuckle, put the nut on. We'll go ahead and tighten the nut down entirely now. It's gonna be the T40 and the 21 mil again. So before we do anything else, I wanna get the axle lined up again with the hub and installing the new axle bolt. So I wanna make sure those threads are engaged. So the key when lining the axle back up is you can feel it line up with the splines, and basically the new axle bolt will pull it flush. Like so. We still have to torque that down, but we're gonna go ahead and torque all these fasteners back down. We're gonna push the suspension up to ride height, torque the control arms, bushings, torque the ball joints, and then worry about the axle bolt after. We're using this pole jack here to put upward pressure on the front suspension. Basically, I'm looking right here to see that some of the weight is coming off this corner of the car. That tells me that we're at ride height. This is especially important for torquing the inboard bushings. It's not so important for the ball joints, but you definitely want to do this for the inboard bushings to prevent them from being in a bind at ride height. If you were to torque them at suspension droop, you're preloading the bushing at suspension droop, not suspension ride height. So doing so could cause the bushings to fail prematurely. So this is an important step. Obviously we're on a lift. If you're doing this at home, you could use a floor jack for this with the vehicle supported on jack stands. Obviously safety first. So our inboard bushing here is torqued to 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees of rotation. which is why we have to replace the bolt. And then we're gonna go another 90 degrees on this. Gonna pretty much eyeball it. So far, 45, 45. There we go. If you wanted to, you could put a paint mark on the subframe, but really from here to here to here to here is 45 two times, 90 degrees, and also you can feel the bolt tightening up nice and snug at the same time. I'm gonna just run this inboard control arm bolt down so that it's snug, and then we'll go ahead and torque this as well. This electric ratchet does not apply that much torque, so we're still way off the number there. Torque spec for this bolt is the same as the thrust arm, so 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. We do have a nut though on this, or a non-captive nut, so we are gonna have to counter hold it with a wrench. And now we're gonna go ahead and hit it with another 90. This one I can actually just about get a 90-degree rotation out of. Okay. Torque spec for the ball joints is just 175 Newton meters. It's gonna be for both. Torque spec for the axle bolt is 210 Newton meters plus 90 degrees of rotation. So, in other words, a whole lot. Went ahead and just put a mark on the axle bolt so we got an idea where we're at. Try to get 90 degrees out of it.